So this is a story that was researched. So yeah, it's called I Helped Them Find Their Dead. My name is Maxi. There isn't a photograph of me, but I'm Wataveta who lives in Taita Savo, in what is today's Kenya. 100 years ago, it was British East Africa, and there had been some big fights between the white and Indian soldiers of the British king and the white and black soldiers of the German king. We were told not to get involved as it was not our war, but some of us were paid to help with the building of the railway line, accommodation and other things that needed doing. Later on, when the fighting moved south and more labour was needed, men were sometimes forced to work for a little pay. My work kept me near home. A few months after the big fight at the dusty hill we call Salaita, a man came looking for some bodies of men who had died in battle. I was able to tell him about 21 graves I knew at Taveta, a local market town. I told the man, an English soldier, that when the Germans were fighting in the direction of Umbuyuni, they used to bring the wounded Englishmen into District Officer House, which at the time was used as a hospital. When these Englishmen died in Germany, the Germans buried them in this place and fired guns over the graves. I then took him about 20 yards, to the north of the 14 graves I had shown him, to show him another 7, which the Germans carried from Mbuyuni. The man said they were going to dig up the graves and move the bodies. I don't understand why it seems important to them. He was also trying to find out which were the English or white man's graves. The burial practices I saw were strange. The Wafu, dead, have a special power, and we believe in the existence of Mgulu, high god. Here, the white man laid the bodies down flat. In our tradition, we stand them up in the ground and build a hut over the space. When our people die, we close their eyes so that the evil spirits cannot enter their body. I don't know who did that for these poor soldiers. Many were lying on the ground for hours before someone found them. We then lie them on a bed. The body is washed and shaved by women past the childbearing age. The head was covered by a foot of soil. 1 year later, we take the skulls to the shrine. At Kuchumbua Maridia, the end of the morning, a year after the burial, we have an event where a goat is sacrificed and the remains scattered over the crops. There is a final day of wailing and shaving. A cow is slaughtered for those who dug the hole, and the hut is either sold or dismantled for someone else to use. Or if the surviving spouse is a woman, she lives in the hut until she dies. The man wrote something down and went away, but I was still confused. A few years later, another white man came along. I took him to a spot about 2,000 steps in the direction of the sun and 125 steps from the railway track near where they used to burn the Hindus who died. The grass was burnt a few times and the ground is swampy, but you can still see where 11 men were buried about 18 months ago, by the wire fence and the outlines of holes which were filled in. The fires had destroyed the fence posts and wooden markers saying who was in the ground. Later in Voa, at the end of the railway line, I heard the man. Milner said he knew his name was. Tell the churchman Verbi and Major Lazel about him what I told him. He said about February 1st, 1916, 21 men were brought into the hospital by German near Salaita Hill. They were badly wounded and died soon after. These were the graves I showed him. When the other men died, they were buried next to the first. There was a strange ceremony which accompanied the placing of men in the grave. The Askari, black soldiers, fired their guns into the sky. This was strange as they usually only pointed them at the people they shoot.
On the 4th of April 1923, this was the date the man said it was. This man asked me confusing questions which I didn't understand, something about native Christian cemeteries. He then asked me where the camp was, where the men were working on the construction on the railway. He said something about a loose leaf register, South African natives, South African railway, and Cape Corpse being buried. Oh, I knew where the grave railway workers were, and the South African natives. This was 2,000 steps from the Taveta station and 125 steps from the railway track. This is where the cemetery was, and was marked by barbed wire. There were 11 graves. I also took Milner to the foot of the hills on which the old fort stood in Tavita, and showed him a place where I dug a grave for Germans to bury the Englishmen in. The Englishmen had been shot by Germans for spying and brought into a building on the hill during part of the day. The German askaris carried them on a rough stretcher and followed the mourning and my friends, and where I told them to dig a grave. The Germans brought a box which they placed in the grave and fired shots after. 19 nights later, the 23rd of April, native minister of Tavita CMS missions named Joanna Melba, who could talk English, told the Englishmen that he, Joanna, was taken prisoner by the Germans and placed in the building on the hill close where they were standing. This happens in August 1914. In early September 1914, he said the Germans brought in the man who had been caught spying with a captain on a small hill towards the Serengeti. The captain was shot dead after, and the man with the Germans brought in and ran away and got a motorcycle and was shot on the leg. After the Germans had put the man into the next room with Joanna, the Germans brought the man's clothes and some papers into his room and asked him what was written on them, but he did not tell them. He tried to pronounce the names, which sounded like Croati. He remembered the man was calling for water all night until early morning and seemed to be in very great pain. Then all was quiet. I couldn't believe it. Minister Joanna Melba had seen the man I had to dig a grave for. These Englishmen kept saying, "What a small world."
Thank you.